Joining us now on the line from the Foss Building at Queen's Park, Dwight Duncan, Minister of Finance and the member for Windsor-Tecumseh. Minister, good to have you on the air again. How are you tonight? Good to be back, Steve. I'm glad to hear you're doing well because the books of the province don't seem to be. Revenues down $778 million. The deficit now up to $16 billion for this fiscal year, although you do say we are still on track to eliminate the deficit by 2017-18. Let's go through this. How come revenues are off so much?
Growth in the economy, Stephen. By the way, that's the gross amount that they're off. We've also had a decline in our interest on debt, so the net amount's about $433 million. But all that being said, we base our growth estimates on the private sector consensus. At the time of the budget, the private sector consensus was 2.6% for Ontario. It's now down to 2%, so that's roughly a 25% decrease. We, for prudence sake, set it 0.2 of a point below that. And so that's what's going on, and we still have growth in the economy. What's more troubling about recent economic outlooks, and this is a pretty consistent view from all economists, is that we're going to have a protracted period of relatively modest growth. Not the kind of growth that can support in and of itself getting back to balance. In a sense, we can't rely on growth in revenues to get us back to balance. We have to look at every piece of government and the broader public sector, make the difficult choices that will help ensure the sustainability of our health and education system.
Well, you've led me to the next question, which is how can you still commit to Ontarians that you'll balance the books by 2017-18 when growth rates are going down so significantly?
Well, we have to adjust on a whole range of fronts, particularly spending. We did our tax plan for jobs and growth, which included the HST. We've taken Ontario's tax system from being one of the most efficient to being one of the most efficient in the world now. Now we have to turn our attention to not just spending, but to the way we do things. And we're looking, I would think, at probably one of the most enormous budgets in Ontario history coming up in 2012. There are great opportunities to do things better, but it's all about the sustainability of those public services as well as creating jobs.
Well, let's drill down a little deeper on that. I went to the Ontario Economic Summit today at the Royal York Hotel and heard Premier McGuinty talk about, yes, the need to balance, but with these four key provisos, and I'd like to go through them with you if I could right now and have you speak to them. Protecting health and education spending. Does that mean that the health and education spending envelopes will be the same, well, relatively speaking, this year over last?
No. We have to, well, excuse me, yes, because health we got down to 3.5% last year, which, by the way, is very low. We're looking in the 3 to 3.5% range. The challenge with that is, given the size of healthcare relative to our overall spending, when you keep it at that level, in order to achieve what economist Don Drummond says we need to do 1% per year over the next several years, that means you're looking potentially at substantial cuts in other ministries. We want to avoid that, but clearly the challenges ahead are going to be great.
So if health's at 3.5%, education's going to be what?
1.5.
1.5.
But those two ministries, I mean, that implies, first of all, that implies a significant change within those ministries, okay? But secondly, it implies enormous change in the balance of ministries. Now, those are kind of what I would call very high-level numbers. We have a number of tools at our disposal. We have a number of years to get back to balance. We have to every year set goals, and we have, and we're now starting the third year, we'll be starting the third year of our plan to get back. We have met or exceeded our targets in each of the previous 2 years. In fact, this year we're on track to be below where we said it would be. We said at the time of the budget this year's deficit would be $16.3 billion. By the way, we said that in our 2010 budget as well.
But we'll you said $15 billion before that. I mean, after that, forgive me. You did say you'd be down to 15.
We said that in the summer when, in fact, growth projections were still going up. That's how volatile this thing has been. And by the way, again, that's a $1 billion difference on a $125 billion budget. So what you saw in the summertime was, in fact, real. Growth projections went up as recently as August, but they've really taken a downspin in the last several months, not just for Ontario, globally. The problem we're having is what's happening in the U.S. economy, what's happening in Europe. Ontario simply isn't isolated from those events.
No, I appreciate that. Okay, number 2, proviso that the Premier said today was no across-the-board cuts. Why are you rejecting that approach?
Well, you know, Don Drummond put it this way. He said, when you do a straight across-the-board cut, let's say 20%, okay? So you cut 20% from good programs that are meeting goals, and you leave 80% with programs that aren't that good and aren't meeting targets. You have to take a much more, as I said in the false statement today, you have to take a much more sophisticated approach. The other thing that often happens when you do those kinds of things, you wind up laying people off, for instance, then hiring them back as consultants. We saw that under the Harris government, for instance. And so I think we have to take a more sophisticated look at it. We have to look at outputs as opposed to inputs. You know, the traditional model at Queen's Park, if there's a problem, put more money into it. We never look at the output. If there's a problem, is it because we're not spending the money wisely? And those are the kinds of, I would think, cultural changes that have to occur if Ontario is going to get back to balance and, again, leave a better province for our children and grandchildren.
Proviso number 3, no tax increases. This one, I guess, puts you in the same camp as the 10 people who are running for the Republican presidential nomination who have also said no tax increases under any circumstances. You feel comfortable being in that company?
You know, 2 short months ago, both opposition parties accused us of raising taxes on everybody. We have actually brought forward a huge change in Ontario's tax system. The tax plan for jobs and growth lowered personal and corporate taxes, created the HST. Ontario's gone from having one of the least efficient tax systems to one of the most efficient now. We took dramatic steps on the tax side already. We have to do the same thing as we look at expenditures, as we look at assets, as we look at what government does overall. And so we've already taken dramatic steps. I'm less concerned about the Republicans in the U.S. than I am about our opponents who said we've raised taxes, which is patently false. But at this point in time, tax cuts aren't on and tax increases aren't on.
Proviso number 4, no privatization of public health care. How come?
The system works. All the advice we've had, even from Mr. Drummond, is that our public health care system works. Single payer, public health care system. Does that mean there aren't services provided privately? Of course there are. In fact, I think today 43% of Canadian health care is privately delivered. Our doctors are private, our drug companies are private, most long-term care is private. We're now building new hospitals under AFP models very successfully. So there is a role for private sector, but it'll be a single payer with universal access. I think most Canadians agree to that. I think that's the wise way to approach it. But there are efficiencies that need to be found. I've had the opportunity just in the last couple of days to meet with some leading experts who tell me that our healthcare system from acute care through to long-term care to palliative care isn't properly integrated. You know, our community care services, our aging at home strategies, not properly integrated with our acute care system. There's a lot of work to be done there. I think we can do it. Remember last year we changed the way we pay for generic drugs. We saved the province $500 million. We're able to maintain service for Ontarians. Those are the kinds of things we're going to have to do more of.
The Conservative Party leader Tim Hudak said today that if you wanted to save $2 billion over the next 2 years, you ought to impose a mandatory pay freeze on anybody who's paid by you. You won't do that. How come?
Well, we are not funding pay increases. First of all, we have frozen them for non-bargained. Second of all, we're not funding increases. So we've already taken that money out for last year and this year. There are challenges associated with wage freezes, legal, constitutional. It's not necessarily a cure-all. I worry that Mr. Hudak is trying to go back to the old Mike Harris approach, which shouldn't surprise anyone. He was an integral part of that government, where it's a scapegoat issue. You scapegoat public servants, you scapegoat teachers. Look, they're going to have to be difficult decisions. Frankly, we're going to need the help of our doctors, our teachers, our public servants, our university professors. We're going to need all of them helping us. I don't want to get into that kind of name-calling, that kind of demonization that so characterizes the conservative approach. Does that mean there won't be difficult choices? Absolutely not. In fact, we've already reduced the size of the public service by 5%. We're looking to move that to 7%. These are difficult trade-offs. We refuse to fund collective agreements above 0 and 0 over the last 2 years. And by the way, Steve, our average rate of settlement in the public and broader public sectors is now below the private sector average, below the federal average, and I think, and I'm going to have to double check this, below the municipal average. So we actually have had some success, but I am not going to be part of that scapegoating and demonization. The reason the Harris experiment failed miserably was because they couldn't sustain it politically. This is not about blaming one group in society or another. This is about working together, moving forward together in a positive way that will help ensure the sustainability of our health and education systems.
No, I hear you, and sadly, I've only got a minute left for you to answer this one, but that's, let me put it this way, that might be what some would call a generous interpretation of the facts. A tougher interpretation of the facts might be that you guys haven't got the guts to go after the public sector unions and really force them down. What would you say to that? You're forcing the other agencies, boards, and commissions of government to do that dirty work for you.
Mr. Drummond, first of all, we don't necessarily have the legal authority. It's unlike British Columbia and Quebec. Second of all, Mr. Drummond has pointed out, and will be pointing out, that where these wage freezes have been brought in the past, they haven't worked. So you hold things down for 1 or 2 years, and what happens in year 3? Boom, they go up. It's short-sighted. It hasn't worked anywhere else, and it hasn't even worked in Ottawa this year. So you know what? We're going to take a more thoughtful approach to this. We need to work with them. There will be difficult decisions. I can assure you of that. That being said, I'm not going to participate in the kind of games that the Harris, you know, they freeze wages 2 years, and if you look at their record in the last 5 years of office, their wage settlements were almost twice what ours were. And so we're going to avoid those mistakes. We're going to get it right. We're going to avoid Walkertons. We're going to avoid Ipperwashes. We're going to build a better economy, ensuring the sustainability of our schools and our hospitals.
Minister, always appreciate it when you find time for us here at TVO. Thanks so much.
Always good to talk to you, Steve. Thank you.
Dwight Duncan, Minister of Finance, MPP, Windsor-Tecumseh.